His fifth governess in 11 months came off the ranch at a dead run, hat gone, hair loose, hollering something about snakes in the wash basin, and a house cursed clean through. Hank Brixton stood on the porch and watched the hired wagon rattle down the lane toward Rowan Hill until it was nothing but a smear of dust, and he felt the same tired weight drop onto his shoulders that dropped every time. Behind him, in the black mouth of the barn, 2 boys were laughing so hard they'd folded over into the hay. Gideon, Toby. The laughing stopped, not fast enough. "That's 5, Hank said, still facing the road. 5 since your mother passed, and this one didn't even get her trunk unpacked." He turned around. Gideon, 11, had straw in his hair, and a garter snake looped loose around one wrist like it was a pet he meant to keep. Toby, 7, was trying to look sorry and mostly succeeding at looking pleased with himself. "I ought to tan the both of you." "You never have," Gideon said, not unkindly, just true. "Might start." He didn't, and they all 3 knew it. He sent the snake back to the creek with Gideon, sent Toby to the well to fetch water he didn't need, and stood alone in the yard a long moment looking at the house that had been too quiet since Louisa died of the fever 2 winters back, and too loud since, in the particular way of boys who'd learned that being ungovernable was the only thing that still felt like control. He needed a governess. He needed, more urgently and more bitterly than that, to keep his sons. That truth had arrived by letter 3 days prior, in his late wife's sister's narrow, slanting hand. Ailia Marsh wrote from Kansas City to say that she had heard from whom. She did not specify. That the Brixton boys were running wild. That 5 governesses in under a year spoke to a household in disorder. And that a widowed man alone could not be expected to raise 2 motherless boys with any decency. She proposed, with the icy courtesy of a woman who considered the matter already settled, to come to Rowan Hill for the town's Founders' Day social in 6 weeks' time, see the situation for herself, and if her fears proved founded, pursue guardianship through the courts, so that Gideon and Toby might be raised in a proper home, with proper female influence. Hank had read it twice, then folded it into his shirt pocket, where it had sat like a stone ever since. He did not doubt Ailia had the money for lawyers. He did not doubt, either, that a judge looking at a ranch that had chewed through 5 governesses in less time than it took a calf to wean would find her argument persuasive. What he doubted was that Ailia Marsh, who had visited exactly twice since Louisa's funeral and cried more over the good silver than over her own nephews, loved those boys the way he did. But love did not win in a courtroom. Order did. Stability did. A settled household did. He had 6 weeks to make Rowan Hill Ranch look like one. Prudence Ren had been called many things in her 26 years. Capable was one, though it was rarely offered as a compliment. Plain was another, and that one came often, usually from women who meant it kindly and men who didn't trouble to lower their voices. She had grown used to both. She had grown used, too, to the particular arithmetic of being the woman nobody wanted and everybody needed. The one who sat with the dying when their own kin couldn't stomach it, who took in mending nobody else would finish by deadline, who had raised herself from the age of 9 in the county orphan home in Independence, and come out the other side neither bitter nor soft, only steady. The way a fence post is steady, plain, upright, and load-bearing. She was hemming a wedding dress that would never be hers when she saw the notice pinned outside the mercantile in Rowan Hill. Governess wanted, Rowan Hill Ranch, HBRIXTON. Good WAGS. Must be stern of nerve. She had heard of the Brixton boys. Everyone in 3 counties had heard of the Brixton boys. The story of the last governess fleeing on foot down the county road, 1 boot lost in a mud puddle, had done 4 days of work at the mercantile counter alone. "You're not thinking of it," said Mrs. Ada Coyle, the postmistress, following Prudence's eyes to the notice. Mrs. Coyle meant well mostly, in the way of women who had decided long ago that Prudence Wren's future held nothing worth envying, and had made a kind of comfortable peace out of pitying her instead. That house has run off 5 women who were prettier and better bred. Then she stopped herself, flushed, patted Prudence's arm as though the unfinished sentence hadn't landed exactly where it was aimed. What I mean is, it takes a particular sort. I expect it does, Prudence said, and did not feel the sting the way Mrs. Coyle expected her to, because she had built, over 2 decades of practice, a wall too smooth for small cruelties to catch hold of. She looked back at the notice. Good wages. She had $11 to her name and a landlady who wanted the rent a week early on account of her nephew needing the room. She had, besides that, an itch she couldn't name, something under the plainness and the steadiness that wanted, for once, to be tested against something that wouldn't simply crumble the way most of her days did, unremarked and unremarkable. She wrote her name at the bottom of the notice before she let herself think better of it. Her landlady, Mrs. Prout, had given her a week's notice that morning, apologetic but immovable, on account of a nephew arriving from Ohio who needed the room and the rent that came with it. Prudence had nowhere pressing to go and no family to write to about it, only the small, familiar dread of a woman who had learned early that a roof was never truly hers, only borrowed until someone with a better claim arrived to reclaim it. She had $11 folded into her Bible and a trunk that held, in its entirety, everything she owned. A ranch 3 miles out, however fearsome its reputation, offered a room, wages, and she admitted this to herself only once, quietly, before setting the thought aside as impractical, the strange, unfamiliar possibility of being needed rather than merely tolerated. She walked the 3 miles to Rowan Hill Ranch the next morning rather than spend money on a hired trap, and arrived with dust on her hem and her chin level, the way she arrived everywhere. Hank Brixton had interviewed 4 women that week already, one who fainted dead away when Toby produced, with great ceremony, a dead crow he'd been keeping in a hat box, one who lasted 4 hours, one who took a single look at the boys' faces, identical in their bland, waiting innocence, and turned around without a word, and one, God help him, who wept before she'd even sat down. The 5th to arrive was tall and plain-featured, dressed in gray wool gone thin at the elbows, with a face that gave away nothing at all, and she did not flinch when Gideon opened the door instead of him, informed her the last governess had died of fright, and slammed it in her face. Hank, watching from the barn where he'd been pretending to check a harness, saw her stand a moment on the porch, smooth her skirt, and then simply open the door herself and walk in. By the time he came up from the barn, she was seated at his kitchen table with both boys across from her, a cup of coffee she'd apparently made herself in front of her, and an expression of profound and unhurried patience. "Mr. Brixton," she said, rising, "I'm Prudence Ren. Your son informed me the last governess died. I told him that seemed unlikely, as I'd heard from 3 separate people in town that she left on foot in perfectly good health, and that a boy clever enough to invent a story ought to be clever enough to make it harder to disprove." She looked at Gideon, not unkindly. "You'll want to work on your details." Gideon's mouth had fallen slightly open. Toby was outright grinning. Hank looked at this plain, steady woman who had walked past his son's ambush like it was weather, and felt something shift in his chest that he did not have a name for yet, only knew it was the first time in 11 months he hadn't immediately begun composing the notice to replace her. "You're hired," he said, "if you still want the position, having met them." "I still want it," Prudence said. "I'd want it more honestly if they hadn't tried quite so hard. A boy who works that hard to frighten someone off is a boy who's been frightened of something himself." She glanced at the mantel, at the framed photograph of a young woman with Gideon's same solemn eyes, and did not ask, though Hank saw the question pass behind her face and be set gently aside, the way a woman sets aside a thing she knows isn't hers to touch yet. "My wife," he said anyway, "2 winters back, fever." "I'm sorry," Prudence said simply, without the performance of sorrow he'd grown so tired of accepting from the town's well-meaning women. Then she turned back to the boys. "Now, I understand there's a snake involved in this household somewhere. I should like to meet it on my own terms rather than find it in my bed at midnight, if it's all the same to you." Gideon, despite himself, laughed. The first week, they tested her properly. Toby put a bullfrog in her water pitcher, and she used it calmly to teach him the difference between Rana and Bufo. And by supper time he'd forgotten. He was supposed to be tormenting her, and was instead cataloging every frog on the property with the fervor of a boy who'd found, for the first time since his mother died, someone willing to be curious alongside him instead of afraid of him. Gideon was harder. Gideon was 11, old enough to remember his mother clearly, old enough to understand what her death had cost his father, and angry. Prudence recognized the anger immediately, having worn a version of it herself as a girl in the orphan home, in the particular silent, testing way of a child who has decided that if he cannot control whether people leave, he can at least control when. He greased the porch steps. She noticed before she stepped on them and had him scrub them clean himself, without anger, only the flat statement that a man who set a trap ought to be willing to clear it. He told her ghost stories at bedtime, meant to send her running to sleep with the lamp lit and her door barred. A headless drover who walked the north pasture on moonless nights, a woman in white who wept at the well and pulled under any governess fool enough to draw water past dark. Prudence listened to everyone with genuine interest, asked precise, unhurried questions about the drover's boots and the weeping woman's particular grievance, and took notes, ostensibly for her own edification, in a little book she made a show of consulting. By the third telling, Gideon had grown so entangled in his own contradictions. The drover was headless, yet Gideon had specified the color of his eyes twice, in 2 different colors, that he broke off mid-sentence and admitted, scarlet to his ears, that he'd made most of it up out of an almanac and his own boredom. "A fine effort all the same," Prudence told him, closing her little book. "Though I'd work on keeping your details consistent if you mean to frighten the next one properly, assuming there is a next one, which I don't intend to allow." He tried silence last, 3 full days of it, refusing to speak a word to her, and this was the one Prudence understood best of all, because silence was the weapon of a child who has learned that his voice has not been enough to keep the people he loved from leaving him, so he has decided to withhold it before it can fail him again. On the 3rd evening, she sat down across from him on the porch steps, where he sat alone in the last of the light, and did not ask him to speak. She simply took out the shirt she was mending and worked at it in silence beside him, for the better part of an hour, until the sun went down and the first stars came out over the western ridge. "You're not going to make me talk," Gideon said finally, sullen. "No," Prudence agreed. "I'm not going to make you do anything. I had a woman try to make me eat when I didn't want to once at the home where I grew up, and all it taught me was how to hold food in my cheek until she wasn't looking. Making doesn't work on people who have already decided not to be made." She bit off her thread. "I'll sit here as long as you like, though. Quiet is a fine thing to share if it's shared and not just endured." Gideon didn't answer. But he didn't get up and leave, either, and the next morning he was the one who told her, unprompted, where the good blackberries grew along the creek, which Toby confirmed with wide-eyed betrayal was a secret Gideon had never told anyone, not even their father. Hank, watching all this from whatever distance his ranch work allowed, and he found himself arranging that distance to be shorter and shorter as the days went by. Felt the house begin, for the first time in 2 years, to exhale. She was, he came to understand, unrattleable in a way that had nothing to do with coldness and everything to do with a particular hard-won steadiness. The steadiness of a woman who had needed, all her life, to be the one thing in the room that didn't break, because there had rarely been anyone else appointed to that job on her behalf. He found himself, some evenings, lingering at the supper table past the point his work required, watching her correct Toby's grammar without a hint of scorn and parry Gideon's testing silences without a flicker of hurt, and thinking that she was not plain at all, not really only quiet in a way that took time and attention to see past. The way a plain field takes a season to show you everything growing under the surface of it. He said as much to his foreman, Silas Boone, one evening at the corral fence, and regretted it instantly by the grin that spread across Silas's weathered face. "Took you long enough," Silas said. "Took me nothing. I'm saying she's good with the boys." "Sure," Silas said, entirely unconvinced, and went back to currying the gelding with the particular satisfaction of a man who has just watched his employer lie badly to himself. Hank did not examine the feeling closely enough to argue the point further. He had a letter in his shirt pocket that he read too often, and a Founder's Day social bearing down on him in 5 weeks' time, and Ailia Marsh's cool judgment to survive, and he told himself that whatever warmth had crept into his chest where Prudence Ren was concerned was gratitude, only gratitude, for a household finally settling. It was not only gratitude. He knew that even as he told himself otherwise. Rowan Hill, in the meantime, had begun to talk, as Rowan Hill always did. It reached Prudence second-hand, the way such things always did, through Mrs. Coyle's careful, poisoned kindness at the mercantile counter, that folks were saying it wasn't fitting, a hired governess dining at the family table, rather than taking her supper alone in the kitchen, as governesses properly did. That folks were saying a widower ought to know better than to let a plain, unmarried woman get so comfortable under his roof, whatever her usefulness with the boys. That folks were saying, with the particular relish of people who had run out of scandal about the Brixton boys, and needed a fresh one, that Hank Brixton would do well to remember what a hired woman's affections were worth once a prettier prospect came along. "I don't repeat it to wound you," Mrs. Coyle said, in the tone of a woman who repeated things for precisely that reason and simply preferred not to own it. "Only you ought to know what's being said, so you can conduct yourself accordingly." "I conduct myself the same regardless of what's said," Prudence answered, and meant it, though she felt the old familiar sting settle deeper than she let show. Not for herself. She was long practiced at absorbing the town's opinion of her without flinching, but for what it might cost Hank and the boys if Ailia Marsh's lawyers ever got wind of loose talk about impropriety in the household. A judge would want stability. Gossip, however baseless, was the opposite of stability. She said nothing of it to Hank that evening, not wanting to add one more weight to a man already carrying his sister-in-law's letter folded into his shirt pocket like a stone. But she took to eating her supper a shade more correctly after that, sitting a careful few inches further from his end of the table, and Hank noticed the distance within a day and asked her plainly what had put it there. "Talk," she admitted when he pressed, "about propriety, about a hired woman getting too comfortable." "Let them talk," Hank said, with a flatness that surprised her. "I buried a wife I loved and spent 2 years watching my sons come apart at the seams, and the first thing that's put them back together is sitting 3 inches too far from my table on account of what Ada Coyle thinks is fitting. I won't have it. Sit where you sat yesterday." She did, and if anyone in Rowan Hill thought less of her for it, she found, to her own quiet surprise, that she had stopped minding what they thought some weeks back and hadn't noticed the exact moment it happened. Prudence, for her part, had not expected to find in this gruff, tired rancher a man who noticed things, who noticed, for instance, that she took her coffee black because sugar had been a luxury she'd learned young not to expect, and began, without comment, leaving a little tin of it by her cup regardless. Who noticed that she went stiff and quiet whenever talk turned to family, and did not press. Who noticed, on the evening she finally got Gideon to laugh outright for the first time in 2 years, that she'd gone to the barn afterward and cried alone for a full 10 minutes, out of some feeling too large and unfamiliar to name, and came to find her there not to ask why, only to hand her his handkerchief and sit with her in silence until she was ready to walk back to the house. "You didn't have to come find me," she said, that evening in the barn, embarrassed. "I did, though," Hank said. "Man have to be blind not to see what you're doing for those boys. Blinder still not to see what it's costing you to do it, careful as you are never to let them see you spend anything on their account." Prudence looked at him a long moment in the lantern light. This weathered, plain-spoken man who had buried a wife and nearly lost his sons to their own grief and hers, and felt something in her chest crack open that she had kept sealed since she was 9 years old, and had decided that the surest way to survive being unwanted was to want nothing loudly enough to be disappointed by it. "Nobody's ever noticed what it costs me," she said. "Mostly people just notice that I don't break." "I notice both," Hank said. "Always have since you walked past Gideon's fool ambush like it was Tuesday weather. Woman doesn't break because she's got nothing in her worth breaking, that's one thing. Woman doesn't break because she's decided, on purpose, every single day that she's not going to, that's another thing altogether, and it's the harder one and the finer one." He said it plainly, without flourish, the way he said everything, and it landed in Prudence with more force than any pretty speech could have managed. "I'd be obliged if you'd let somebody notice it from here on. Costs you nothing to let me." She didn't answer him in words. She let him take her hand, work-roughened and steady in the lantern light, and for a long moment neither of them moved to let go. Ailia Marsh arrived 4 days ahead of the Founders' Day social, unannounced, in a hired trap from the depot, dressed in city black and carrying an expression of prearranged disappointment that she did not trouble to soften. She found, instead of the disorder she had come prepared to catalogue for a judge, a house that ran quiet and warm, 2 boys who greeted her with correct if reluctant manners, a supper table set with more care than she expected, and a plain-faced governess who answered her pointed questions about the household's routines with such calm, thorough precision that Ailia found herself twice at a loss for the follow-up she'd planned. "You've done well," Ailia allowed, grudgingly, on the second evening, cornering Prudence alone in the kitchen while Hank saw the boys to bed. "Better than I expected. Better, frankly, than any of the others managed in a month, let alone, how long have you been here?" 6 weeks, Prudence said. 6 weeks, Ailia repeated, faintly. Then, with the particular cruelty of a woman unused to being wrong, "It won't hold. A hired woman's affection for another woman's sons only runs so deep. You'll leave same as the rest, the moment something better comes along, or the moment my brother-in-law does something to drive you off the way he's driven off every woman since Louisa including. I'd remind you, Louisa's own sister, who has called at this house exactly twice in 2 years, and been made to feel, both times, that her concern for these children was an intrusion rather than a kindness." Prudence set down the plate she was drying, considering the woman in front of her grieving too, she realized, in her own brittle, unacknowledged way, for a sister lost, and nephews she loved clumsily, and from too great a distance to know how to close. "Mrs. Marsh," I was raised in a county orphan home by women who were paid to care for children and mostly didn't. I know exactly what borrowed affection looks like, because I grew up starved of the genuine kind and fed on the imitation instead. What I feel for Gideon and Toby isn't that. I don't expect you to take my word for it. I'd only ask you to watch a little longer before you decide. Ophelia did not answer that night, but she stayed on, watching. Through the 4 days remaining before Founder's Day, watched Gideon show Prudence, unprompted, the spot along the creek where he went when he missed his mother most. Watched Toby fall asleep with his head in Prudence's lap over a book she was reading aloud. Watched Hank Brixton look at his son's governess across the supper table with an expression Ophelia recognized, with a pang she hadn't expected, from her own sister's face in the early days of her marriage. The storm came the night before Founder's Day, rolling in off the western ridge faster than the sky had promised, and it was Toby who went missing in it. He had overheard, that afternoon, a fragment of Ophelia's conversation with Hank on the porch, enough to understand, in the incomplete and catastrophizing way of a 7-year-old, that his aunt meant to take him and Gideon away to Kansas City, away from the ranch and the creek and the frogs and Prudence, and he had done the only thing his 7 years of reasoning offered him. He had run, meaning to reach the Delancey place 2 miles off, and beg old Mrs. Delancey to hide him, until the danger of Aunt Ophelia had passed. He was 3/4 of a mile from the house when the storm broke in earnest, and by the time Gideon came running to the porch, breathless and near tears, to confess what he'd overheard his brother whisper of a plan, the rain had turned to a driving sheet that swallowed the lantern light past 20 feet. "I'll go," Hank said, already reaching for his coat, his rifle, the rope coiled by the door. "You'll go with me," Prudence said, already pulling on her own boots, and there was no arguing tone in her voice at all, only the flat certainty of a woman who had decided a thing and would not be moved from it. "I know that creek path better than you think. Gideon showed me the way to it himself, the very spot Toby would run to if he was scared and wanted to disappear a while. You'll lose an hour searching blind that I can save you by knowing exactly where to look first." Hank did not argue. There was no time to, and some part of him, the part that had watched her walk unrattled through 6 weeks of every test his sons, and his sister-in-law had thrown at her, trusted her judgment now the way he trusted very few things in this world. The lantern gave out twice before they reached the creek path, drowned by the driving rain, and each time it was Prudence who crouched low over the wick with her back, turned to the wind and coaxed the flame back with steady, unhurried hands while Hank called Toby's name into the dark until his voice went ragged. The path itself had turned to running mud, and twice Hank went down to one knee in it, and both times Prudence hauled him up without a word wasted on whether he was hurt, only forward, only faster, her skirts soaked through and clinging, and her plain face set in the same unrattled calm she wore over spilled ink and greased porch steps, because a boy lost in a rising creek in the dark was, to her, only one more thing in the world determined to break her. And she had made a lifelong habit of refusing. They found Toby 40 minutes later, huddled in the hollow of a fallen cottonwood along the creek path, soaked through, and shivering hard enough that his teeth clattered, the creek itself risen dangerous and fast beside him from the storm's runoff, close enough that another quarter hour of confusion in the dark might have seen him try to cross it and be swept. "I didn't want to go to Kansas City," Toby said, sobbing, the moment Hank's arms closed around him. "I didn't want to leave Prudence. I didn't want to leave you." "Nobody's going anywhere," Hank said, fierce and rough with relief. "Nobody's taking either one of you anywhere, not while I've got breath in me." And over the boy's soaked head his eyes met Prudence's, and in them was a promise larger than the one he was making to his son. They got Toby home and warm and dry, and it was Prudence who sat up with him through the worst of the night's chill fright, humming the same tuneless, steady hum she'd used to settle Gideon's silences weeks before, until the boy's shivering eased into ordinary sleep. Ailia, standing in the doorway and watching this plain, unrattled woman keep vigil over a child that was not her own with a devotion no court document could manufacture, and no wages could purchase, understood at last what she had come to Rowan Hill unwilling to see. "I was wrong," she said quietly to Hank in the hallway near midnight. "I came here to prove you'd failed them. Instead, I find you've built, out of grief and stubbornness and a plain-faced woman with more backbone than half the wealthy matrons of Kansas City, exactly the home Louisa would have wanted for them. I'll trouble you no further about guardianship. I'd only ask to visit from here on as an aunt and not an inspector." "You'd be welcome," Hank said, and meant it. The stone in his shirt pocket finally, fully dissolved. Founder's Day dawned scrubbed clean and bright. The storm's fury spent overnight into nothing more than puddled streets and a washed blue sky, and the whole of Rowan Hill turned out for the social same as every year. But this year, there was new talk moving through the crowd, and for once it did not concern which governess had fled the Brixton ranch on foot. Hank found Prudence near the lemonade table, where Mrs. Ada Coyle was in the midst of informing her, with the particular strained brightness of a woman revising a long-held opinion in real time, that she had always said Prudence Ren had hidden depths. Hadn't she always said so? "Miss Ren," Hank said, and something in his voice made both women turn. He did not care, for once, who was listening, not Mrs. Coyle, not the assembled matrons of 3 counties who had spent a year and a half writing off his household as a lost cause, not even Ailia, watching with an unguarded softness from the porch of the church hall. "I've got something I mean to say, and I mean to say it here, plain, in front of the whole town that spent a year deciding my sons were unmanageable, and my house was cursed. Hank, you walked into that house past every trap 2 grieving boys could set for you, and you didn't break, and you didn't leave, and somewhere in the 6 weeks since, you made my sons whole again and made this old, stubborn rancher fall in love with you besides. And I expect half this town is too polite to say what they're all thinking, so I'll say it plain instead. Prudence Ren, I don't want you as my son's governess anymore. I want you as my wife, if you'll have a man who took entirely too long to see what was standing plain in front of him the whole while." The lemonade table had gone entirely silent. Mrs. Coyle's mouth was open. Prudence, who had spent 26 years being the steady, unremarkable thing that other people's dramas happened around, found for the first time in her life every eye in Rowan Hill fixed on her, waiting, and discovered that she did not mind it in the least, so long as his eyes were among them. "I'll have you," she said, "though I'll remind you I'm still plain and still stern of nerve, same as the notice asked for." "Ma'am," Hank said, taking her hand before the whole gathered town, "that notice was the finest piece of luck I ever posted." And he kissed her there in the sunlight while Gideon whooped, and Toby, delighted past all containing, informed the nearest matron at great length about the exact and specific superiority of Rana over Bufo. Ailia Marsh, watching from the porch, found she was smiling despite herself, and thought that her sister, wherever she rested now, would have approved entire-heartedly of the plain, unrattled woman who had walked into a house nobody else would stay in, and simply, steadily, stayed.